Hi, Misha here, and as I've stated in the past, the Sikorsky Sea King is one of my favorite aircraft, really, of all time. It's kind of what I grew up with, and it was so versatile for the U.S. Navy, as well as the navies of Britain and others. And speaking of Britain, you've seen this model in a few videos. This is my Westland SH-3A, which was the anti-submarine, the ASW version, based on the SH-3D, license produced, beginning in 1969, running through the 90s in the UK. And to this point, I've really only had UK variants of this helicopter because Corgi really makes the best 1/72 scale die-cast models, and they've mostly focused on British because they are a British company. But scheduled for December of 2019, in reality came out in January of 2020, they finally released an American version. This is the SH-3A, circa July of 1965. So this is the original production model, initially known when it went into service as the HHS-2, later redesignated SH-3A in September of 1962. And while this was designed as an ASW aircraft, this particular one is a bit unique too, and another reason I really wanted it, because it is modeled after the ones used by the Tridents, and this is one that would rescue space capsules as they returned to Earth. Now, 1965 would have been the middle of the Gemini program, and I'm sorry I don't have a 1/72 scale Gemini. I have a bigger one, but I do have a 1/72 scale Mercury. We'll put it here just for comparison. And the Sea King did pick up the last 3 Mercury missions, beginning in May of 1962 with Aurora 7. So that's pretty cool. So we'll put the little Mercury capsule on and kind of put it underneath. How about that? I do have a 1/72 scale Apollo. The later SH-3D Sea King did rescue the Apollo capsules, but it's pretty big, and I don't know. So that'd look better with the Mercury. Plus, that's more in keeping because, in all honesty, the Gemini capsule was not a lot different from the Mercury. A little, about 50% bigger. Problem is, it had 2 people inside, so in a way, it was even more cramped. So I thought I'd talk about this model here from Corgi. And just for comparison, I brought out a less expensive, more economy-minded model here. This is actually from the Japanese Maritime, in other words, Navy, Self-Defense Force. Still 1/72 scale die-cast, but this is from Altea. So not quite as refined as a Corgi, but then again, it's less than half the price. So, you know how it goes. So the story in America, I've told the British story of the Sea King before, but the American story begins in the 1950s. The U.S. was building up its carrier fleet, which would, I'm going to move this just a little bit, yeah. Don't want to knock my little capsule off. Poor Gus Grissom has been through a lot. Anyway, the U.S. focused on surface fleets, specifically carrier groups, while the Soviets would focus on submarines. attack and nuclear. Ultimately having a fleet of over 200, becoming a major threat to the U.S. Navy as well as any allies on land. So to counter this, the Navy basically asked Sikorsky if they could develop a new anti-submarine warfare, ASW, helicopter that could combine the roles of hunter and killer. Prior to this, with the earlier piston engines and even whatnot, one helicopter could not lift the required sonar and carry weapons to attack. But the idea behind the new helicopter, it would be fitted with the new turbine, turboshaft type engines, would have 2 of them, and it would be able to both detect and destroy, if necessary, Soviet submarines. It would need to be able to have an endurance of at least 4 hours over the ocean. It would need to carry a weapons payload of at least 850 pounds, plus, of course, the required sonar and later magnetic detection gear, which is not light. It would need to have a crew of at least 4. You'd have a pilot, a co-pilot, and then 2 operators of the specialist gear in the back. Of course, it would need to operate from carriers, so on and so forth. So they requested Sikorsky do this in 1957, and they needed a flying prototype by 1959. Now, originally they ordered 10 prototypes, sort of pre-production models. There wasn't really an open competition. Sikorsky was just kind of, So they worked on it, and in March 11 to be exact, of 1959, the SH-2 first flew, and it would be the only true prototype. Now, they would originally order 10. They would actually end up producing 7 more for a total of 8. The next ones would be classified as YHS-2 for testing and evaluation. As far as I can tell, the other 2 were not delivered. I may be wrong. Sorry, I'm not an expert in this at all. But it seems like testing and evaluation went so smoothly that they just put them into production. In early 1961, the Navy would take possession of 2 of the YHSs and give them sea trials on board the carrier Lake Champlain. They would perform well, and then the Navy would accept it into service formally in June of that year, adopting it as the HHS-2. And the first production model would be delivered from Sikorsky in September. So it was just going into service, and not long after the helicopter went into service, it was being used in the space program. Like I said, its first mission was in May of 1962, specifically on May 24, and it would continue this through the Apollos. So it had a very long career of rescuing astronauts after they touched back down on Earth. So, not Major Tom. Some might get that joke. I love David Bowie. Anyway. And it would, of course, since it was originally designed as an ASW, that would be its primary function in the fleet in the early 60s. And like I said, in September of 62, with the Tri-Services kind of cooperative naming system, this would become the SH-3A. The CH-3B would be a dedicated transport version used by the Navy as well as the Air Force. The Marines would also use some as transports, including VIP, and eventually they would even use these as Marine 1 for the President. But it took off. It was pretty smooth, and it was pretty advanced for its day. It was, like I said, a 2-turboshaft engine. It was actually the first maritime ASW aircraft to have turboshaft engines. It was very large for its day at just under 55 feet long. Had a max speed of over 160 miles per hour, but it preferred to cruise at more like 130. Ceiling was a little under 15,000 feet, not bad for a maritime aircraft developed in the late 50s. Like I said, it had a standard crew of 4. The 2 in the back, you'd have one guy reading the data from the sensors, and the other guy would actually be kind of interpreting it, monitoring the equipment. Even with those 2 guys and all the gear in the back, there's still room for 3 more passengers or specialists if needed. Sorry about the hand thing, guys. People comment, but remember, blind, so by knowing where my left hand's at least have some idea of where to put the camera. But that was the detection part, the hunter part. For the killer part, it could carry up to 4 homing torpedoes or 4 depth charges. But it was also used for many other roles. That was its primary, but it had many secondaries. For example, it was used as a troop transport. It could carry up to 28 troops. In a search and rescue role, it could carry up to 22 seated survivors of, a maritime accident or whatnot. In a truly medical role, it could carry 9 stretchers plus a couple of attendants. So pretty large in the back. Of course, when you did that, you strip out a lot of the specialist gear. In the fleet, these are very popular. They would usually deploy Sea Kings, have them flying whenever fixed-wing aircraft were taking off and landing, because if someone had to ditch, this would be what would go and rescue them. Speaking of rescue on the ocean, one neat feature, the hull of the Sea King was watertight. And it had these big pontoons on the side. Plus it had inflatable bags. It could float. It could land on the ocean and float, either in case of emergency where it needed to repair, or if it needed to rescue someone and they couldn't use a winch or something. It couldn't float forever. It's still a helicopter, but it could float. And this was pretty revolutionary. In a way, it was the first truly amphibious helicopter. And frankly, although this is a very innovative and cool feature, it was essentially never used. In fact, the replacement for this, another Sikorsky, the SH-3A Seahawk, the maritime version of the Blackhawk, would kind of abandon this. So it was something they tried out. Hey, it was the 60s. People were trying out all kinds of wacky stuff. And the U.S. Navy was no exception. They were also used kind of as patrol early warning aircraft to fly around the fleet. And they were even used to deliver mail between vessels in a carrier group, or high-ranking personnel again. Just, it was a easily configurable and reconfigurable aircraft with the 2 engines and everything. It was modern, it was safe. It did well. Of course, when Vietnam rolled around, it was in use. Again, it was mostly used as a search and rescue, both for downed pilots in the ocean and on land. They were even sent into Vietnam to pick up, or I should say North Vietnam to be exact, pilots. When they did this, they would give them extra armor. They would also fit them with door-mounted machine guns. The U.S. Air Force would fly a version known as the SH-3A, but more affectionately known as the Jolly Green Giant, because it was big and green. And they would use it for transport, search and rescue, troop delivery, and extraction as well. But because it was so big, it wasn't quite as useful in the jungles as the famous Huey. But still, the Jolly Green Giant was there. And then that gets us to this one here from 1965. This was used to rescue the Gemini missions. Actually, in June of 1965, so right before this model was designed after, or right before, Gemini 4 would splash down, and that would be the mission commanded by James Divot. But more famously, the pilot, Ed White, would perform the first spacewalk for the USA. Of course, Russia had done so earlier. It's also worth remembering Mr. White because he lost his life in service to the country with Apollo 1. So I always like to remind people, as did Gus Grissom, which my Mercury model is of. Yes, I know that the Sea King did not actually rescue his capsule, but it's the one I have. And they all look the same except for the name. Then, in the mid-60s, an upgraded version, the SH-3D Sea King, would be introduced as a new ASW for the Navy. It basically had more powerful engines, new, more advanced sensor gear, navigation equipment, mostly internal changes. And so the Ds would replace the As. Many As would be upgraded. And there would be some brand new production Ds as well. Ultimately, Sikorsky would have made 245 A models for the U.S. Navy. And counting the Ds, they would end up building about 330. Now, eventually, even the Ds would be superseded by newer versions like the G and even the H. But by this point, these were just upgrades. Sikorsky would quit making brand new airframes in the 1970s. But Westland would continue. Actually, right as Sikorsky was kind of ramping down, Westland was ramping up. They would build nearly 350 on their own. And it's a very similar helicopter. This one, you can actually see the equipment in the back here, because it's still on the anti-submarine. It's very similar. It's about a foot longer, thanks to a few changes. The American version used a data link to communicate and work with the fleet, the air group, and the carrier group. The British version was designed to operate more autonomously to fit the needs of the British a little better. And they would both have versions kind of more transport and not amphibious. In Sikorsky parlance, company name for this was S61, and the S61L was a dedicated land-based version, with the S61R being the land version for the U.S. Air Force. And in Britain, it would be the Commando, or the HC4 and 5. This here, the Japanese version, was known as the S61B by Sikorsky, but while the components were built in the USA, it was actually assembled in Japan by Mitsubishi, and originally was called the HHS-2, but later they would adopt the SH-3 name just like the USA, and they would fly these in Japan until around 1995. Actually, ultimately, they ended up replacing a lot of these with the AW101, which I've done a video on. At this point, I'm kind of getting more and more helicopters. But usually when Japan does something, I like to talk about it because of my interest there. And it also shows that Sikorsky, while the U.S. Navy was a major customer, this was a very successful plane, not only on the military export market for land and sea, but also even the civilian market. There were a lot of commercial versions. Sikorsky would end up making over 1,100 total, so not bad. And of course, they were not only produced in Japan and Britain, but also in Italy by Augusta, who would later join with Westland. So yeah, in the 1970s, Sikorsky would quit making new airframes, but they would continue to upgrade their existing ones, keeping these very relevant as anti-submarine and other uses through the 1980s. And by the 1990s, the newer SH-60 Seahawk was starting to really replace these, especially in the ASW and other frontline combat roles. But the good old Sea King was kept around as a second line transport and just duty. It was basically tried and true, and just kind of a favorite amongst the fleet. It wasn't officially retired completely until 2006, January 27th, in a very big Navy ceremony, thus ending a very illustrious career that spanned 45 years. Not bad at all, Sikorsky. Not bad, especially considering they were given pretty tight constraints, and this was a very versatile, flexible helicopter. And for more on the British, like I said, I've done a couple of videos. You can check the playlist. I also talk about the Corgi models in that list, and this one has the same basic features that you would expect. I'm going to move Mercury off just not to get in the way. We have the side door that opens, revealing a pretty plain interior, honestly. Some of the Corgis have benches and even crewmen in the back. These don't. They do have crewmen in the front, in the cockpit. They have rotating landing gear wheels. Even the back little wheel rotates, which is pretty nice attention to detail. They come with a nice metal stem stand. The base is plastic, but this is very heavy-duty metal, which gives it good balance. It's not going to easily tip over. Of course, you have rotating tail blades. Not only do you get rotating main blades, you can they come with two sets, one kind of drooping for a landed look, if you want to display it on its wheels, or one kind of upswept for an in-flight look, if you want to display it on the stand. And it always amazes me how smoothly the Corgis rotate. They're very buttery, and it's a very heavy model. It's pretty much all die-cast except for part of the, well, let me think, the pontoons, are they? Actually, I take that back. The pontoons are metal. The wheels, of course, are plastic. The horizontal stabilizer is plastic. The vertical part, not exactly the stabilizer, is all metal though. Propellers, rotors are all plastic. The door is plastic. But yeah, the main body is all metal. So, Corgis aren't exactly cheap, but they are cheaper than Hobbymaster. They're around $80 to $85. But they do limited editions with cards. They come in pretty good packaging. I actually like the Corgi boxes. They're kind of an open top box. A little more heavy duty. Knock on wood, now that I say this, my next one will be broken, but I've never had a Corgi come in broken. They just seem really well packaged. And they're not as difficult to get out of the packaging as the Hobbymasters. In a way, I do like them better. Hobbymasters are a little better at detail, but Corgis are a little more heavy-duty. If that makes sense. And I like the NASA connection. And I didn't have a early Sikorsky Sea King, and I didn't have a US one, and I didn't have a NASA one, so it kind of hits all the things. As far as the Altea, like I said, it's quite a bit cheaper. These are about 30 to 40 bucks, depending on where you can find them. They're getting a little hard to find. They are die-cast. No pilot figures, but you do get internals. No sliding door. You do get a pretty good stand. It's all plastic, but it does plug into two spots, so that's nice. The gear do not rotate. The tail rotates, the rotors. This one's a little stiff, but it does move. The main rotor is a little more free. It's pretty good. It is metal, but it has much more plastic than the Corgi. For example, the under side is all plastic, but the top is the metal. The tail is plastic. So really on this one, your die cast is your main fuselage. And I think the pontoons are plastic, yeah. So yeah, basically the metal that gives us some weight, has decent weight, is all on the front. But, you know, for 30-ish bucks, it's definitely an upgrade from a Mercum, as I've said. And I like the stands. These come with really, for an inexpensive model, they stay on their stands because there's 2 holes, not 1. And it's a wide base. I actually kind of prefer these stands over Hobby Master. They don't feel as strong a plastic, but they're more stable. They actually feel, the stands kind of feel like they're 3D printed. But that's okay, because they even have the name of the helicopter on them and stuff. So I don't have a problem at all with Altea, especially their helicopters. They are a good value. But if you can afford a Corgi, you definitely feel like you're getting your extra money's worth from the weight of the metal, the nicer stand, the pilot figures, the moving door, the undercarriage, which sorry, it's hard for me to show those, has more detailing. I'll try, guys. It has the little connection on the bottom. The hoist and everything is pretty well detailed there. Hope I'm getting something for you. People have asked me to pick stuff up, but I'm just so nervous. I pay for these, so I'd feel sick. Typically when I'm moving them around, I use both hands, so if something slips, I've got my other hand ready. But it's either drop a $80 model or drop a camera, so not good options. But yeah, since this just came out and I haven't seen any videos on it, I thought I would do my humble attempt. If you have any questions, please feel free to comment. And again, if you'd like to see a couple of the British versions, check out that playlist. This is Misha. If you could, like, share, and subscribe. Otherwise, I will catch you very soon next time.